Hello and welcome to this video on being queer and autistic, a brief introduction for therapists. My name is Tess and my pronouns are they and them. I'm a gender, relationship and sexual diversity therapist working in private practice. I also work part-time within my local social services in a learning disability and autism team. As this is only a brief introduction, if there is any terminology that I say that you aren't sure of or don't understand, most queer or LGBTQIA+ definitions can be found in the Stonewall Glossary, and you can see the link here. Or you can search for the Stonewall Glossary in whatever search provider you use. For autism terminology, Autism West Midlands have a PDF glossary, and you can see the link here, or you can search for Autism West Midlands Jargon Buster. Alternatively, you can search for the term you're unsure of and find it that way. There are a couple of definitions I do want to discuss in this video, and the first one is the double rainbow. Queer people are represented as a whole by the rainbow flag, and many variations of this flag now exist. Autistic people are often considered to be on a spectrum due to it being a large range of experiences and behaviours grouped together. In their book, Queerly Autistic, Erin Ekins says that autistic people on the spectrum don't all share the same traits, but many share similarities. She talks about the scientific definition of a spectrum as the rainbow of colours in visible light, and so the rainbow infinity sign has been taken as representation for the autistic community. This is why queer autistics are often said to be living or existing under a double rainbow. The second term I want to discuss in this video is Autigender. Autigender isn't explicitly saying that autism is a gender, it's about the relationship an autistic person has with their gender. The term is about acknowledging that gender is a social construct, and part of autism sometimes includes difficulties interpreting and understanding social construct. As such, someone's understanding and experience of gender can be fundamentally affected by them being autistic. As being Autigender is about the relationship with gender rather than specific gender itself, a person can be Autigender and non-binary, cis, trans, agender, a man, a woman, etc. And not all autistic people will identify with being Autigender. There are many myths around this client group. For instance, the contradictory assumptions of non-sexuality and heterosexuality. In the book Cryptiques, Alyssa Zisk discusses these, and that visibly breaking one of these stereotypes increases the strength in which people assume the other one. Heterosexuality is seen as the default in our society, and Zisk combines this with the idea of the difference slot. That is, that everyone has a singular difference from the norm, and therefore, if someone is autistic as their difference, they must be heterosexual. Non-sexuality is often assumed due to the belief that disabled people shouldn't have children, and those who aren't having children shouldn't have sex. This is the moral obligation of celibacy. Queer people face scrutiny as their sexual activities often don't have the goal of conception, and so this moral imperative for non-sexuality becomes stronger for queer disabled people. For queer autistic people, this is stronger still, as there is a belief that autistic people are unable to understand and identify their own sexuality or gender identity. They are infantilized, and there's a belief they should not be having relationships as they don't know themselves. In my practice, I've yet to come across someone who is autistic who is unable to understand themselves in this way. And this is echoed by the therapists Eva Mendez and Meredith Maroney, who in their book Gender Identity, Sexuality and Autism also suggest that for some queer autistic people, knowing and expressing this identity may even be less distressing, as they may not be internalising cis heteronormative norms like neurotypical LGBT individuals. Another myth is that being transgender is caused by autism. This stems from the increased amount of gender variance in autistic populations. A study by George and Stokes found that autistic people are up to 6 times more likely to express gender variance than neurotypical people. This link between gender variance and autism is hooked into by researchers, and this is a cause of much frustration for queer autistics, and it is highly reductive. Sam Hope talks about this in their book, Person-Centered Counselling for Trans and Gender Diverse People. They They say that a number of traits cluster together, such as non-heterosexuality, joint hypermobility, synesthesia, ME, CFS, fibromyalgia, physical conditions like EDS and POTS, gender variance, certain facial features, dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and dyspraxia. However, very few people are talking about this cluster, including medical professionals, and the focus seems to be solely on autism and gender variance, or autism and non-heterosexuality. I asked some queer autistic people what they wanted from a therapist, and here are some of the things that they said. I'm not a person with autism, in the same way I'm not a person with queerness. I'm a queer autistic. You can't separate me from my queerness or my autism, and I wish professionals would stop trying to do so. And here's an illustration of that. I've taken inspiration from the page Identity First Autistic. You can see the first picture showing a person with autism, like an accessory that can be put down and picked up, where the second image is an autistic person. It's an intrinsic part of their identity and cannot be separated. This is known as identity first language, and it's the preference for the majority of the autistic community. In 2015, a study by the National Autistic Society, Royal College of GPs, and the UCL Institute of Education found that 61% had a preference for this term. When you've spent a lifetime dealing with trauma from being queer through escapism, that's hard to turn off. Let people talk about their interests, and I guarantee you'll learn more about their issues than if you tried to force them into talking in a more traditional manner. And another person said, I will probably be masking for the first 3 months, and trying to stop me could have the opposite effect. I go slow. These two comments, and many more that I received like them, show the importance of working with your client and not trying to fit them into a particular style of therapy. It also suggests that for some autistic people, brief short-term therapy might not be that beneficial. One comment that came up many times was that of self-diagnosis. People said they should accept that self-diagnosis is valid. I wish they took self-diagnosis seriously. When your therapist doesn't believe in self-diagnosis, angry face. Why is self-diagnosis so important? Well, getting an actual diagnosis isn't an easy process. Many counties don't have an adult diagnostic service, and those that do tend to have long wait times. And in order to access that waiting list, you have to go and present your case to your GP. If you can afford a private assessment, due to local services often refusing to accept a diagnosis from a private source, the places that these private diagnoses are accepted from often have long waiting lists too. It's also important to mention that to get an autism diagnosis, someone has to engage with medical professionals. Queer people often have a lack of trust in healthcare providers, with a Stonewall report in 2018 finding that 1 in 8 LGBT people have experienced some form of unequal treatment from healthcare staff because they're LGBT. A third of trans people have experienced unequal treatment, and 1 in 5 non-binary people and 1 in 5 LGBT disabled people have experienced unequal treatment. The study also said that 1 in 4 LGBT people have experienced inappropriate curiosity from a healthcare staff member because they're LGBT. Half of trans people, more than a third of non-binary people, and a third of LGBT disabled people have also experienced inappropriate curiosity. The study also found that 1 in 20 LGBT people, 8% of LGBT disabled people, and 1 in 5 trans people has been pressured to access services that are supposed to change or suppress their sexual orientation and or gender identity. When you take all of this into account and you add the information that clinicians can sometimes allow their bias towards sexual minority people to affect their diagnosis, as shown by studies carried out in Michigan, it's understandable why queer people are hesitant to seek diagnosis from medical professionals and why self-diagnosis is seen as valid. Having a diagnosis, either from a professional or self-diagnosis, allows people to find a community. However, for queer autistic people, that can be difficult too. This is because support spaces tend to cater for a single difference. Queer spaces, more often than not, don't have the access needs for autistic individuals. Stereotypes of autism are upheld and aren't questioned, and so autistic people are still expected to fit in with neurotypical people, and masking is exhausting. Autism support spaces, on the other hand, tend not to be queer friendly, and so an autistic person needs to appear allosexual, cis, heteronormative to be accepted into that space. That doesn't leave queer autistic people with a lot of options for in-person support. So a lot of the time you will find queer autistic people supporting each other online. And this leads on to needing knowledge of the wider society context. Working with this client group isn't just about the person sitting in front of you, it's about the society we live in. As Christina Richards and Meg John Barker say, there's an inevitable tension between freedom of expression and fitting in, e.g. in order to achieve other life goals and or to avoid daily abuse. We live in a society that is constructed for white, allosexual, cisgender, heterosexual people. And although rights for people outside of this norm are better than they were here in the UK, they are still far from ideal. I've covered just a tiny amount in this brief introduction, so here are a few suggestions for some further learning. The intersectional disability justice movement. White children are 19% more likely than Black children and 65% more likely than Hispanic children to be diagnosed with autism. Other models to look at are Myers' minority stress theory and Oliver's social model of disability, and its criticisms nearly 40 years after its inception. One more thing to possibly read up on is why the autistic community is rejecting the puzzle piece symbol. Here are my references for this video. If you like to read them, please pause and have a look. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, and I hope it was helpful.